Little Nightmares is a fictional series, but it does have a lot of parallels with the real world. In this video, I'm going to explain some of the psychological principles, some of the potential links to psychology, and I'm going to offer my theories and opinions on the psychological themes of Little Nightmares. Now, firstly, a caveat. I do have a psychology degree, but I am not a practicing psychologist. I will be talking about some studies, but I'm not going to be doing a deep dive into the psychological research, because honestly, it's quite dry and boring, a lot of it. And this video is meant for entertainment purposes. So therefore, we're not going to take this as fact. We're not going to take this as scientifically backed up. It is just supposed to be an insight into some of the psychology, and a lot of it is based on my opinion, and a lot of the research is going to come from the internet. Also, I will be talking about psychological disorders, but yet again, I can't offer any advice on those because I'm just not qualified to give that. So without further ado, let's look at the psychology of the Little Nightmares series. Part 1. Psychological disorders. The Hands, Alien Hand Syndrome. The hands in Little Nightmares 2 are an odd thing. I think it's safe to say that there is a fairly obvious inspiration here, but they also might be referencing something much less obvious. Not only do the hands move completely independently, they also seem to move while the bodies that they detach from remain lifeless. They seem to be incredibly aggressive, attacking Mono at every opportunity, and they don't seem to be affected by light like the mannequins are. This could all be a reference to Alien Hand Syndrome, or AHS. No, not American Horror Story. This syndrome, which is fairly rare in psychology, is characterized by one hand or another limb acting seemingly independent from the owner. People who suffer from this condition often state that the hand seems to have a mind of its own, but even more than that, the hands often act to undermine or hinder the person. For example, people with AHS report that the hand might knock a glass out of their other hand as they pick it up. It might unbutton a shirt that they've just buttoned up, and sometimes it might even attack the owner. People with AHS acknowledge that the hand, or the limb, belongs to them, but many report the feeling that it is being controlled by somebody else or that it has a mind of its own. This is where the alien part of Alien Hand Syndrome comes from. While AHS is actually a far more complicated syndrome than I would want to cover in this video, and trust me, I wrote a paper on this in university, the hands that we see in Little Nightmares 2 could also be seen this way. They act independently from the bodies that they detach from, they act with their own mind, and they certainly act to hinder Mono's progression. Is this just coincidence? Maybe, but it's interesting to think that the hands in Little Nightmares 2 aren't quite as impossible as you might think. Body dysmorphic disorder. The lady from Little Nightmares 1 is often seen as a very vain woman, one that cares about her looks to an almost unhealthy degree. However, we could look at the lady's symptoms and theorize that she could be suffering from body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD. The symptoms of BDD are listed on the National Health Service's website, and yes, that's our 3 healthcare service. Thanks, United Kingdom. Some symptoms can include worrying a lot about a specific area in your body, particularly your face, looking at yourself in mirrors a lot or avoiding them altogether, going to a lot of effort to conceal flaws, for example by spending a long time combing your hair or choosing your outfits. We see all of these behaviours in the lady. She has a lot of mirrors, but most of them are broken. Furthermore, when she does look in her mirror, the face that we see in the mirror and the face that we see on her body look very different. It's possible that the mirror is showing her true form, her monstrous form, but it could also be possible that that is just how she sees herself. Autophobia. Autophobia, or monophobia, is simply put a fear of being alone or lonely. We've already covered this in another video, but mono definitely seems to fit the bill for this one. People with monophobia hate being alone, so much so that not only can they experience extreme anxiety when alone, but even when they anticipate they are going to be alone. I have already theorized that Mono seems to feel a need for companionship, and this could follow through into his evolution into the Thin Man, which could in part explain why the Thin Man seems to abduct people into the signal tower. It also makes Mono's tale all the more tragic. Trapped in the signal tower, Mono is doomed to grow up alone, which is his worst nightmare. No wonder the Thin Man seems so monstrous. Moreover, one possible symptom for monophobia is feeling the need to flee. We see that Mono starts the game by flying through the television and landing in the forest. Could it be that Mono was fleeing in the first place? Either way, Mono definitely has strong links to monophobia, even down to his name. Survivor's guilt and PTSD. For those that haven't seen all of my previous videos, I've already established a link between 6 and 2 conditions, survivor's guilt and PTSD. The two are commonly linked and most often occur after a traumatic life event or loss. 6 could definitely be displaying some of the symptoms in Little Nightmares 2. We know that 6 tried and failed to save the girl in the yellow raincoat, leading to her death and the presumed death of the pretender. The Six that we see at the start of the game has clearly been affected by something, and I theorise that the events at the nest could be the cause, but there is another link we could make with Six towards the end of Little Nightmares 2 and in Little Nightmares 1, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a commonly misunderstood disorder. Many people confuse symptoms of schizophrenia with other disorders such as dissociative identity disorder. In fact, it can be such a difficult condition to diagnose that some people think the term should not be used until a clearer definition has been made. That being said, some common symptoms of schizophrenia can include a lack of interest in things, feeling disconnected with your emotions, wanting to avoid people, and finally, hallucinations. Six could fit a number of these symptoms. She passes a music box in Little Nightmares 1 and barely even looks at it, which is strange considering her attachment to one in Little Nightmares 2. She seems to be aloof and shows very few emotional reactions even after witnessing the horrors of the moor. It could be argued that she wants to avoid people. She leaves Mono behind, she doesn't attempt to help any of the other children in the moor, and she is constantly running away from the people in the moor. Sure, they are mostly trying to catch her, but metaphorically she prefers being alone. And then we come to the hallucinations. As stated earlier, schizophrenia does not mean split personality, but Six is literally seeing a copy of herself. Sure, Mono sees this too, and it's most likely related to her abduction by the Thin Man and the time she spent in the signal tower, but again, metaphorically, Six is seeing things that aren't there, and they are pushing her to do things that we could consider abnormal for Six up until this point. Is Dark Six supernatural, or is she merely a product of Six's fractured mind? Part 2. Psychological themes. So we've looked at just some of the potential disorders that might be being referenced in Little Nightmares. Well, what about the more thematic ideas? In Little Nightmares 2, the viewers are a relatively docile enemy, especially compared to other enemies. As long as they are watching the televisions, they take no care nor notice of anything around them. We could draw an interesting parallel here with childhood neglect. If you think about this entire scenario a little bit more deeply, we can see that the viewers, who are all adults, are completely oblivious to the children who are roaming around the city unrestricted. This has a number of implications or themes that could relate to the real world. Children are, I'm afraid to say, pretty useless when left unsupervised. Any parent will tell you keeping your children safe from danger is almost a full-time job. We even have a term for the act of trying to make your house safer for your children: baby-proofing. So Six and Mono are freely roaming around the Pale City, while the adults are all too busy watching TV to notice. In fact, the biggest danger to Six and Mono is often the city itself. It's a dangerous place. It's crumbling, falling to pieces. There are many dangers here that are not the viewers. Incredibly high falls, electricity, elevators, glass bottles, and so many more dangers lying around. In fact, studies have shown that up until a certain age, children don't actually understand that a fall is dangerous. Just check out the visual cliff experiment. A perfectly safe table is set up with a glass panel at one side. Researchers have tested many children at many different ages and even animals to see whether they would walk or crawl over the glass. The idea here is that the glass presents danger. The pattern on the table is repeated underneath the glass, but our depth perception allows us to see that there is a drop. Many children up until 6 months of age can be convinced to crawl over the glass part of the table, which most older children recognise as danger. It is theorized that this is because up until children start to crawl independently and start to experience tumbles and bumps, they just don't comprehend the consequences of a fall. This is really interesting when you think about some of the viewers as well. Many of the viewers are so desperate to get to the TV that they don't see the danger and they will fall to their deaths. Even more little hints can be found about the dangers to the children here. At several points, Mono and Six have to climb up large objects to progress, and at one point we see Mono dragging a stool and climbing it to open a door. These are very real dangers to children. Many children love to climb. Again, ask parents. Without the supervision they should have, the danger from falls and knocks is a very real thing, and in the Pale City, the parents are too busy watching their TVs to care. This whole thing could be a metaphor for how it's easy for parents to become so engrossed with their media that they forget to properly care for their own children. What's more is that the viewers only react aggressively when they have no TV nearby. This could be an even darker message of the real-life struggles that some children have to go through with parents who are quick to anger when disturbed. The fact that several children in this world are roaming around by themselves, and the fact that children in both the moor and the nest appear to be in high amounts of danger, could all be a metaphorical message about bad parenting, about some parents being monsters, and about how challenging it can be for children to navigate worlds not built for them. We can see a strong psychological message in the first game though too. We can see the obvious connection here with obesity, and as an overweight person myself, I get the message. We as humans have never had such easy access to food. Gone are the days of hunting and gathering. Gone are the days of having to grow our own food. Most of us can now easily just drive to the supermarket for all of our food needs. Hell, even more recently with online groceries, many of us don't even need to do that anymore. We can just sit at our desk and have someone else bring it to us. But I always felt there was a deeper message of the first game. The guests are desperate to consume food, sure, but consumption doesn't just stop there. Consumption could be a reference to Western society, how we consume everything: food, natural resources, and more recently, even the way we consume media. It's take until we die, and all the while there are a select few people who are orchestrating it all. So what has this got to do with psychology? Well, this is all a very recent phenomenon. Like it or not, but life is in many ways much easier for most of us compared to just 100 years ago. Many psychologists are very interested in how this lack of adversity is changing us. Obesity, for example, can be attributed to food being the easiest it's ever been to get, but also with many of us working in far less labour-intensive jobs than ever. Office jobs are on the rise, and manual labour is on the decline, thanks in part to our technology. All of this change is undoubtedly having effects on our psychology, on our brains and our behaviours, and also our health. So many psychologists are interested in studying it and maybe even offering solutions. Part 3. The psychology of the player. One of the most common questions I get in my comment section is why is the world so big compared to the children like Mono and Six? And furthermore, why do we see a family and there appears to be a child who is several times larger than Mono? Well, I don't want to speak for the developers, but it's always been my opinion that this has been done for us, the player. Little Nightmares is a horror series, and while it's not necessarily the most heart-pounding jump scare fest, the world that has been crafted is absolutely scary. By putting us in the shoes of Six and Mono, who are very small children, the developers have been able to craft environments that not only would be scary to them, but by extension, could be scary to us. Since we take control of the protagonists, many people feel a connection to the character we control on screen. In fact, listen to a lot of streamers and YouTubers. When running away from things in games, they will often say, "He's coming to get me," not "it's coming to get Six." Which is really interesting if you think about it, that we often put ourselves in the shoes of the characters because we are controlling their every move. The enemies in the games often aren't necessarily that dangerous either. I mean, not to brag, but I feel like I could definitely fight off at least one of the chefs. I mean, look at their little arms. But why do we flee so desperately from the chefs then? Well, simply put, it's because they are so much larger than Six. Humans do generally fear things that are bigger than them. I mean, tell me honestly, which one of these dogs are you more scared of? The environments aren't only big, but they are a little bit too big. The proportions are off. Some rooms are gigantic, others seem cramped and tiny. The gnomes in the first game seem to have rooms that only they can get to, but those rooms then have objects that a human must have put there initially. This whole feeling of twisted proportions, in my opinion, can subtly trigger that subconscious feeling that something is not quite right. It's not an in-your-face jump scare, it's more of an unsettling feeling. The feeling that you never quite know what's going to happen next. The feeling that escaping is always more difficult than it should be. After all, even if we were the same size as the chefs, would escaping be any easier? I doubt it. The environmental design in all of the games is important to add to our fear of a world that shouldn't be able to exist. It's not human. Not really. I mean, not in the player's idea of human anyway. Why does the moor submerge under the sea? How does it do it? Why is the nest built so high up on a perilous cliffside? Why do the Pale City skyscrapers bend like they barely weigh anything? Simply put, this is the world itself being part of the horror. We fear things that we don't understand, and everything in this world is difficult to understand. Therefore, more fear. Another really interesting thing that adds to the fear or the uncomfortable feeling we get in the games is just how human-like everything is. Let's take the chefs as a perfect example. They are, in essence, human, but they're not quite right. Most of us know that they're wearing masks, but more than that, they look like a twisted version of a normal human. They walk on two legs, they have facial expressions, they have eyes that seem human. Furthermore, they act like humans. They work at their job, they take smoke breaks, they eat the food that they're cooking, they taste test it, they sleep and live in the moor. I think that these humanizing elements actually make these characters more scary. And we could explain this by a phenomenon called the uncanny valley. This phenomenon, which is studied a lot in psychology, can be best explained since the rise in popularity of robots. If a robot looks like a robot, that's fine, it's a robot, and as humans we're fine with this. However, as you start to make the robot look more human-like, there is a sudden and steep tendency for us to dislike them. It actually makes us feel nervous. We don't like robots that look human-like. For some reasons, it unsettles us, possibly because we have some very well-known structures in the brain that are designed to recognize other people and their actions. But as robots start to look and act closer to humans, we like them again. We know that this is still a robot, but because it looks closer to a human, we are suddenly less put off by it. So it's not because we know that it's a robot that it unsettles us, but it could be because our brain starts to conflict with itself. The areas that recognize people start to get activated, but the areas that also don't recognize people start to get activated too, leaving our brains unable to fully decide what we're looking at. And as we've already discussed, humans fear what we don't understand. That is an oversimplification of the science, as most of this video is, to be honest, but if we look at the chefs again, they clearly demonstrate a similar phenomenon. They are human in their behaviours, but it's a little bit off. They have human faces, but they're just not quite right. They even speak, but again, it's just a little bit off. By being more human, they have become more scary than if they were just some mindless monster. We see this replicated as well in Little Nightmares 2. The teacher plays piano. In fact, she plays it quite well. That only adds to the scariness of the situation though, because it adds a human element to her. The doctor does something similar. He washes his hands, or as some people have pointed out, he washes one of his hands. This, again, humanizing element just puts him right in that uncanny valley situation. We know he's not quite right, but our brains are confused because he looks like a human. So they definitely sit in that uncanny valley area that makes us uncomfortable, well, in my opinion anyway. So think about horror games in general. Many of them want to exploit your fears and phobias. Horror often goes after your fear of clowns, or being murdered, or being stalked. Little Nightmares goes after the more subtle fears. And in fact, thinking about it, maybe that's where Little Nightmares comes from. It's not the big nightmares like the clowns, it's the smaller ones. Your fear of being lost in a big city, your fear of being alone, your fear of being overweight, your fear of your horrible teacher, your fear of loss, your fear of not understanding the world around you. All of these fears, while not as big in shock value, have a much more tangible message. They sit there and lurk in the back of your brain while you go about your day, and this is the fear that I think Tarsier and Bandai Namco wanted to exploit. They may seem less scary, but they are actually far more real. The world here is less real, but the fear is even more real than most other horror games will ever know. In essence, Little Nightmares is scary because it makes us look inwards, and life is often a very scary thing, no matter how much we don't like to admit it. Moving to a big city? That's pretty scary. Going to school for the first time? That can be terrifying. Not knowing what's going into your food? That should also be scary. No, Little Nightmares is the kind of game that gets into your head. You think about it for days, weeks, even months after finishing it. And while I think that's because the world and lore are so interesting, I think one of the main reasons why they are so interesting is because they are so damn close to our reality. They might not look like it, but once you start to think about it, the entire world of Little Nightmares is a lot closer to our own than we think. It's all just sat in that uncanny valley region. So these are just some of the psychological links that we could make with the Little Nightmares series. If you did enjoy this video, I have plenty more theories on my channel, and I also have other horror gaming content too. If you are still here, this is probably a perfect time to subscribe, because I will be making more content with games such as Five Nights at Freddy's, Resident Evil Village, and, of course, if we ever get it, more Little Nightmares content if we get another game or any more DLC. I hope you have enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.